This is a simple guide to the development of Victorian Gothic Revival church architecture and the different styles within the overall Gothic style. Victorian Gothic churches are sometimes easy to tell from medieval examples, sometimes less so. And then there's the restored church, which is of course a hybrid. Are you confused by all the different architectural terms? Did you think all Victorian churches are the same style? Do you like visiting old churches but feel you don't know enough about them? If you answered yes to any or all of these questions, this video is for you. I'll take you through the period, explaining some of the styles, terms, and the reasons behind them. The Victorians built a lot of churches in Britain and across the empire. There was a change in attitude to religion in this period. There were controversies over the proper way to worship, new religious movements, the question of the rights of nonconformists and Roman Catholics, and the impact of the work of Charles Darwin. Society was changing. There was growing industrialisation and population growth. It was an exciting and sometimes unnerving period to be alive. I'm not going to attempt to cover all that, but it is helpful to remember the context in which these buildings appeared, and I am going to stick to the church buildings of the Anglican Church in England and Wales and explain why they look the way they do. Urbanisation provided a requirement for the building of new churches, and the church commissioners had already started this work well before Victoria came to the throne. Neoclassical churches were built mostly in London, while in general provincial churches were Gothic. Georgian Gothic was not an accurate copy of medieval Gothic. It stresses height with tall pointed arches and towers and thin buttresses. Industrialisation wasn't universally welcomed and there was a backlash. There was a nostalgia for the days of the craftsman, when things were individual and made by hand and designed by their maker, not stamped out in their thousands in some giant, soulless, smoke-belching manufactory. One of the most famous of these nostalgic designers was Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, whose book's Contrasts argued that everything was better in the medieval past and its buildings were better too, prettier, fit for purpose, and Christian. Gothic, he believed, was quintessentially Christian and the only suitable style for a church. The styles of Greece and Rome, and worse, Egypt, were pagan. His argument won the day. In the 1840s, groups of up-and-coming young architects roamed Europe, sketchbook in hand, enthusiastically recording actual examples of Gothic architecture, ready to reproduce them in Britain as soon as they got the chance. Gothic architecture was studied in a thorough and scientific way, and books were available to explain how the different types had changed over the centuries. The first classification had been done in 1817 by Thomas Rickman, who divided English architecture into 4 distinct periods or styles, which he termed Norman, Early English, Decorated English, and Perpendicular English. The terms are still used today. An important Victorian architectural historian was Edmund Sharp, who further divided the classes of architecture into Saxon, Norman, Transitional, which is the type where pointed arches started to be used but round ones were still hanging around, Lancet with slim pointed arches, Geometrical, where tracery was used, Curvilinear, where tracery was, well, curvy, and Rectilinear, where it was straighter. He wrote a series of books called Architectural Parallels in the 1840s, illustrating these forms. The illustrations were drawn by his pupils, the architects Paley and Austin and Robert Jewell Withers. These young architects had not only studied British medieval churches, but had been to Northern Europe and had collected examples of Gothic church architecture there. This was to be important as it influenced Victorian church architecture by some of the most successful architects who incorporated French and German Gothic styles into their buildings and made them distinctive and quite different to the medieval ones found in Britain. Another influential book published in the 1850s was The Stones of Venice by John Ruskin. This introduced Venetian Gothic into the mix with its use of different coloured materials in construction. All this serious study led to a variety of different styles of Victorian Gothic and, incidentally, the popularisation of church visiting just to look and appreciate the architecture. So if you like church crawling, you can thank the Victorians for getting your hobby going. Now you know some background, I'll show you how Victorian Gothic developed. The 1850s was an exciting time to be an ecclesiastical architect. You had lots of new ideas to play with and lots of churches were being proposed for remodelling or building from scratch. Money was available from funding bodies after the 1851 church census, which revealed that there were insufficient seats in the Church of England churches for the population, and unfortunately these seats were rarely free. You couldn't just turn up at a church and sit anywhere. There were rented pews, private pews, and pew openers who expected to be tipped for their services, and rickety benches shoved out of sight for the poor. Church attendance was not what it might have been because of all this. Nonconformist chapel attendance was growing, and chapel seats, of course, were plentiful and free. Funding was based on the provision of free seats and the proper style of church. In the 1850s, the favoured style was the first pointed style, similar to Early English, but in fact based heavily on French examples, so calling it Early English would be inaccurate. There was additional influence from the High Church Oxford movement and the Cambridge Camden Society, who were advocating a move away from earlier church designs to a focus on sacrament and ritual, to create churches with a focus on the altar and not so much on the pulpit. One of the first of these churches was built, rather surprisingly, at Llangorwen in Cardinghamshire in 1842. This was an early example, but it was in the following decades that things really got moving. 1850s churches that got praised were those with a distinct chancel and nave, a raised altar, and windows which allowed for stained glass. Town churches and country churches had their own style guide, short chancels for country churches and longer ones for town churches, for example. Georgian box pews, three-decker pulpits and galleries were out of fashion and considered beyond the pale. The new churches ranged from the modest to the heavily decorated, and some architects now developed a style that was more than a copy of medieval Gothic. It was truly new Gothic, and the best architects began to develop their own personal styles. The most important church of the decade was All Saints Margaret Street in London by William Butterfield. It used Ruskin's ideas about polychromy, building with different colours. It used brick. It didn't copy existing buildings. It was altogether something new and exciting, and it influenced architecture for a couple of decades. From the 1850s to the 1860s, the boom in church building produced some of the best and most original Victorian churches. Next, we will look at the styles in detail. Brick churches were cheaper to build, and the High Church movement was keen to provide places of worship for the poorer classes in the poorer areas. These were not to be shoddy second-rate churches, though, but intended to give the poor, for an hour on a Sunday at least, a glimpse into the glories of heaven. As already mentioned, All Saints Margaret Street set the standard. St James the Less in Pimlico was commissioned in 1858, finished in 1861 by G.E. Street, to provide a place of worship for a slum area of London. We can confidently call this a polychromatic church, but it's hard to stick another label on it. Street had studied European churches, and this church has influences from Italy and Belgium. Country churches were also built in the polychromatic style. This example is the less exotic-looking St Helens at Little Cawthorpe in Lincolnshire, and was built at the same time as Street's church, but on a tiny budget, by Robert Jewell Withers, a contributor, you may remember, to the books of Edmund Sharp. The style is middle-pointed, but of course there were no polychromatic brick churches in medieval England. In the enthusiastic review of this, published in the Ecclesiologist, it was described as early geometrical middle pointed. So what was that? Geometrical Gothic was another term devised to describe a style which had its origins in medieval architecture but was really a Victorian development. It drew on the architecture of the 14th century particularly, but reinvented it. The watchword for high Victorian Gothic architects was truthfulness. That meant the construction was on show, not hidden. Ruskin wrote, "The relative majesty of buildings depends more on the weight and vigour of their masses than on any other attribute of their design." The later medieval styles of curvilinear and perpendicular tracery didn't fit into this aesthetic. Plate tracery, where windows have almost flat surfaces with shapes apparently cut out, did, as did blank walls and strong roof lines. Again, French Gothic provided much inspiration, seen in the Saddleback Tower at All Saints Selsley by George Frederick Bodley, built in 1862. Interiors of such churches could be elaborate or plain depending on the funds available. It worked for both, but it worked especially well where money was tight. Robert Jewell Withers, a now undervalued architect, made a virtue of having little money to work with, and his geometrical Gothic churches around Cardigan, built in the 1850s and 60s, used geometrical forms to great effect. In fact, they worked so well his style was adopted, if not actually plagiarised, after he ceased designing rural Welsh churches by another architect, Archibald Ritchie of Chester. Geometrical Gothic could be so purely geometrical and have such solidity that it prefigured modernism and brutalism, which came a century later. Some architects took this style to its limits, the Rogue Goths. The term Rogue Gothic was not used by the Victorians. It was first used by the architectural historian Harry Goodhart Rendell in 1949. He described their style as modern Gothic, an eclectic cocktail based on the harshest, most primitive components of Anglo-Venetian and early French. It was an attempt to combine medievalism and modernity, traditional forms and new materials. It's quite a thing to behold, and even the most inexperienced church visitor would be unlikely to recognise it as anything other than Victorian. Whether you like it or not might depend on your taste and how keen you are on real medieval architecture rather than its reinvention, but it was wildly popular in its day for sacred and secular buildings. Rogue Gothic didn't stick strictly to early pointed, but happily took inspiration from wider Gothic forms, which brings us nicely to Free Gothic. This was a later development. The churches after 1880 were subtly different. The rules set down by the Cambridge Camden Society were no longer adhered to so strictly. Later medieval styles were now acceptable, including, towards the end of Victoria's reign and into the Edwardian period, the once despised perpendicular. Medieval architecture was an inspiration, but architects felt happy to mix it up a bit. This style also appealed to Protestant nonconformists, who had generally avoided Gothic as it was associated in their minds with Roman Catholicism, and they wanted their chapels to be different in style from the established church. Interestingly, the round arch Romanesque style didn't worry them and was frequently used. Nonconformist buildings in the Edwardian period sometimes threw everything into the mix with the Gothic. W.D. Caro was the leading ecclesiastical architect in the late Victorian and Edwardian period. A major figure in the arts and crafts movement and diocesan architect, he also sensitively restored many churches and was happy to keep later medieval work that would have been dismissed as debased Gothic by the earlier architects. By the end of Victoria's reign, the church building boom had more or less come to an end. Only areas still expanding needed new churches. Now there are too many churches for the population. Many are in danger of being lost, especially those in rural areas. So, next time you see a Victorian church, I hope you will understand it a bit more and appreciate it rather than just take it for granted and dismiss it as just Victorian, therefore of no merit. I hope you enjoyed this video, which was made after a request from one of my subscribers, and as always, thank you for watching.